I think actually having listened to a lot of the talks, I think the first thing that I didn't write in here that I want to say is upgrades can be hard. Um, One of the main things to call out here is probably represented in my picture is it felt really weird to skip Hyrax 4. And that was something we learned in the process that was a little frustrating and disappointing. And I'll talk about how we got around that. Um, So, the project that I'm going to talk about was for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Their research division is basically a team of about 25 economists doing continuous economic research and publication. They probably publish 10 to 15 papers a month in an IR style repository. Their code base is a Hyrax application that started as Hyrax 2 Beta 4. About 8 years ago, we've been from a Hyrax 2 to a Hyrax 3 upgrade. And basically, they were getting pinged in Hyrax 3 by their IT security folks who were running scans of the application and saying, hey, you've got things that are out of date and at risk. And being a federal institution, their visibility for that and the level of concern around those kinds of things is maybe even a little higher than some of our other institutions. So I think that's key to think of that. It was sort of this security and compliance driver. So one of the goals of this project was to sort of keep the scope focused on addressing those issues, getting to Hyrax 5 as easily as we could, as safely as we could. So one of the goals, therefore, was to only migrate code, to not migrate the data persistence at the same time. So we're having discussions about when that might be a reasonable thing to address later. But this was strictly a upgrade the code base from Hyrax 3 to Hyrax 5. We wanted as much as possible to go in small, visible, incremental, testable steps. And in fact, really tried to do as much of the work as pre-work before pulling the trigger on 3 to 5 as we could. And over the course of the lifespan of this application, there had been a lot of custom styling. And one of the strategies that we adopted was to throw out all of the CSS from previous versions, bring the application up with the default Hyrax 5 bootstrap styling, and really only focus on the homepage, the header, and the footer experiences, and leave everything else as vanilla as possible. That was another piece of trying to cut scope and make the process small and manageable. One of the first hiccups was that over time, the coverage reporting had dropped out of scope in this application. And so one of our first jobs was to get coverage reporting back. It was nice to find out once we had it that we were about at 95%, but it also still meant that there was 5% of our code that was not covered. And I would say the process of actually trying to bring the code up to 100% coverage, we didn't get there, we got to about 99%, gave us a really good lens into what wasn't being tested. We did get the things covered, and the things that ended up not being tested were initializers and other things that were going to be fairly obvious when we brought them up in a QA environment if they weren't working right. A key thing to know is I became the top contributor to this repository by deleting about 45,000 lines of code. So one of the things to think about in your upgrades is, do you have features or code or other things that you can get rid of, that you don't have to test, that you don't have to upgrade? That will simplify the process a lot. In this case, a lot of that code was around an importer from the legacy system that we migrated to from Hyrax, from whatever it was into Hyrax 2, so that code was built around importing into a Hyrax 2 application. It wouldn't work in Hyrax 3 anyways. It definitely wouldn't work in Hyrax 5. So getting rid of that actually let us increase our coverage and gave us less lines of code to have to think about. Our strategy, I should really, rather than saying throw away, I should say that our strategy was to prioritize learning, to be able to work in a QA environment, and we built out the entire upgrade without great testing and without putting it in production in a development branch that we expected we were going to throw away. What we did is we used that to figure out where we wanted to get to, and then we worked backwards from there to figure out what were the small incremental steps to do that once we thought we knew the solution. So as a math major, I used to work this way a lot. If I was really stuck, I'd look at the answer in the back of the book, and then I'd use that to work backwards to the question and help me figure out what were the steps that I needed to get from where I am now to where we wanted to be. And we expected there'd be lots of failures. So we did have blue-green deployment, and we did have a QA environment where a lot of our work was going on. And we did fall back on that blue-green deployment twice in the process. We also leveraged production logs to understand what was really going on in the application. In addition to reading a lot of code, we looked at just a lot of what are happening in transactions and logs. Back to small incremental changes. This is really not meant to throw shade, and people who know where the left-hand side of my screen comes from will know. But and we've had commits like this too, where you have huge numbers of file change. It's hard to reason about those. It's hard to know what they're doing. So we tried to break that down. And again, really, we tried to push as many of those changes into the existing Hyrax 3 application before we pulled the trigger on the upgrade. I think that strategy helped us have a lower anxiety upgrade overall. The gotchas that we ran into were that there is not really a Hyrax 4. So we thought we would our initial pass was to try and upgrade to Hyrax 4. And then as we looked at the documentation and talked to the community, we realized that really wasn't an appropriate stepping stone. And so we scrapped that. Our saving grace was realizing that DASI is a working version of a Fedora 4 application in Hyrax 5. And we basically used DASI as a template and a comparison point to do a lot of our analysis. Still, there were a huge amount of deprecations to deal with. We dealt with as many as we could, but a lot of them were coming from core Hyrax, and that was kind of out of scope. 50% of our log messaging was deprecations when we pulled the trigger on our first trial pilot. We also, Rob talked about bots. We got hit with bots right as we were trying to deploy our production deployment of the upgrade. And that was super frustrating. But again, doing some of the things that Rob talked about in his talk were the things we did to get around that. We noticed a slight reduction in request capacity in the new application. We, again, using logs and whatnot, we extracted about an hour's worth of traffic during a high traffic but not bot attack period. And we were able to play that back against our QA and our staging environments using JMeter and sort of adjust the rate to match what we see in production, be slower, be faster, and see how overall system load was behaving. That was super useful in knowing that when we pulled the trigger on the new system, it was going to handle the request load. Again, that woven in with the bots was one of the places that was kind of dicey in this upgrade. And I will admit, we probably did not reach out to the community as early as we needed to. We did through the process, and folks probably know that I'm noisy. There was an issue, I think, that Randall maybe talked about in the Hyrax presentation he did on Monday about keeping support for Rails 6. That was important to us in Hyrax 5. So that we could do this upgrade again without having to do a Hyrax and a Rails upgrade at the same time. So again, I want to say, reaching out to the community was a thing we didn't do enough of, and the community support that we did get in the process was fantastic, and we should have taken more advantage of. This is really just to talk about, one very specific, relatively small application, but I wanted to give some links. So again, we imported, I won't go to these links, but we basically compared, I think I brought in the DASI gem file and compared it to what we had in our running application and used that comparison of what are the gems that have changed in the gem file and the gem file lock to be one of our first planning points of where are we going to have to address things. Number two, we found that JSON logging, enabling that in our Rails app and our Apache web server, and then using our platform is an AWS GovCloud environment with CloudWatch, but being able to use log analysis tools with good, well-formatted JSON logs was incredibly powerful. And that's a relatively small change to a Hyrax application. There's a link here for the changes from our final released version of 3.6 to our first version of 5.0. I think it's actually 5.0.1. And that shows kind of how we minimized. And if you look at the commit history before and after that, you can see the things that we left till after a production release and the things that we did in 3.6 before that. And then again, in terms of incremental, that first release let us stay on Rail 6, which was very helpful for our process. There's a second set of commits where we moved from Rail 6 to Rail 7, and that's the Hyrax 5.1 releases, and that's those changes. So I just wanted to share what it looked like for one repository and for us. And I'm happy to have either in the comments here or in the future have any discussions or help folks who might be working on similar things, because I'm thinking these aren't the only ones where we might have to do this work in the community. I want to super thank our project partners. Kate Hansel is the research division librarian, who is my primary point of contact, who is, also their kind of head of QA unofficially, because there's no one else to do it. Working with Kate made the process delightful and certainly lowered the stress on the overall process. And Molly is Kate's manager and our fiscal sponsor and another voice of reason and someone who helped put through some of the code deprecations and some of the feature removals that we did to reduce scope and make things easier. So super thanks to both of them for making this a great project to work on. So thanks. And if there's any time for questions, I'm happy to answer any questions.